Let me introduce you. This is my girlfriend, Alina. Alexander, smiling, said this as the woman next to him greeted. Nice to meet you. Girlfriend? Confused, I heard Alexander immediately clarify. I guess I hadn't mentioned it yet. I'm going to marry Alina. That's why I want a divorce. What? I was speechless. Alexander, without any concern for me, continued fluently. I realized what my parents were saying was right. You know, when I think about it calmly, it's getting hard being with an older person. Alina is young, 23 years old. New was always better, right? Alina nodded in agreement. Besides, you said your accident was nothing serious, right? Just a fracture. I don't want to be with someone who slacks off on housework because of that. We'll take the house. His outrageous statement left me dumbfounded. When someone says something this far from normal, you don't even feel like talking anymore. I took a deep breath and said, Okay, here, the divorce papers. I handed over the signed document. You're well prepared. Ignoring their joy, I began preparing to leave the house. While I was packing, Alexander called out to me. You don't have anywhere to go back to, right? There's an apartment near the station. Rent's for $200. It's old and damaged with cracks in the walls, but hey. Alexander, that's terrible. They laughed and mocked. Without responding, I slammed the front door shut. Let them laugh all they want. I have a place to go. A place they could never imagine. My name is Malia Kloss. I turned 40 this year. My husband, Alexander, 35, and I married 3 years ago. No children. We live in a house I bought when I was single. It's secondhand but renovated, so it's a nice place. I bought a house before marriage because of my childhood. We were poor. No dad. Actually, he disappeared before I was old enough to remember. Still don't know where he is. It was just mom and me. Mom loved me, but life was hard for her alone. But having mom was enough for me. However, she passed away from illness when I was in high school. It was a shock, but I couldn't afford to wallow in grief. I had to live on my own. After graduating high school, I got a job at a small local advertising agency. Worked hard in sales. It was around the time I passed 30 years old. Back then, I was totally absorbed in my work. I probably won't get married. That's what I used to think. I at least wanted my own house, so after saving up, I bought an affordable used house. I took out a mortgage, but I've made several extra payments and have already paid it off. That's when I met Alexander. He worked at one of our client companies. I found Alexander, who was 5 years younger than me, a bit unreliable, but he seemed impressed by the way I efficiently handled work. He asked for my contact info and we started going out often. To my surprise, I was happy. I had lived solely focused on work without a family. No one had ever clearly told me they liked me before. I accepted Alexander and we started dating. And soon after, we got married. Initially, Alexander's parents didn't approve of our marriage. I was older and I had no parents, but Alexander stood up for me. Malia's been working hard even without parents. Don't say that, he firmly told his parents. I was honestly happy. I thought marrying Alexander was the best decision. I felt I could make it work with him. But that changed. The change in Alexander started less than 6 months after we began living together. It happened one night. Alexander came home from work and immediately sat at the living room table. Dinner was pot roast, salad, and country village soup. After starting to eat, Alexander put down his fork. What's wrong? I've been meaning to say this. Alexander sighed and said, This country village soup? You made it this morning, right? It tastes like leftovers. Can't you make it fresh for dinner? But it takes time. I have work too, and I can't make it in time. I'm sorry, but that sounds like an excuse. At my parents' house, we always had different soups for morning and night, and there aren't enough side dishes. I'd like more variety. I was taken aback. According to Alexander, I've been thinking this for a while, but kept it to myself. That's what he said. True, I'm not the best cook, but with work, I can't afford to spend so much time on it. My mother-in-law was a housewife, you know. I have a job and can't make that much. So don't make excuses. You're a housewife. It's expected. You should do at least that much. I couldn't agree with Alexander's intimidating attitude, but arguing seemed to make things worse, so I held back my words. I had grievances, but I wanted to avoid arguments. Since then, I tried to finish work on time and rushed home to cook, but Alexander's remarks escalated. You're using cheap meat, aren't you? This side dish is the same as yesterday. Don't repeat dishes within a week, okay? Dealing with his comments were overwhelming, and cooking started to take over my life. I found myself constantly thinking about meals all day, restless. Alexander's nitpicking wasn't just about that. He would check the house for dust in every little corner. You haven't cleaned, he complained to me. I did clean regularly, but apparently it wasn't enough. Just stop complaining all the time. If you notice something, why don't you do it yourself? I blurted out, unable to hold back anymore, and Alexander retorted harshly. What are you talking about? Housework isn't my job, is it? Don't shift the blame. I hate to say this, but maybe people without parents really can't handle housework properly. I was dumbstruck by his words. He never used to blame me for not having parents. Was this the real Alexander, and the one I saw before just an illusion? I wished for the old Alexander to come back, but my wish seemed in vain as things only got worse. Overwhelmed by Alexander's incessant demands for housework, I was completely exhausted. Continuing like this, balancing work and home seemed impossible. Encouraged by Alexander, I decided to quit my job. It was a job I loved and had since high school graduation, but it seemed there was no choice. In hindsight, maybe I should have left him then. But I had always put work first and had little experience in relationships, and I didn't really know what a normal family was like. Meeting Alexander's demands seemed like my duty as a wife. I thought I just had to endure a bit to maintain a peaceful home. Becoming a housewife did give me more time for household chores. Alexander's complaints lessened, and I felt genuinely relieved. I thought the problem was solved, but one day, Alexander went out on his day off in the evening. He said he was visiting a friend's new house they'd built. He came back that night reeking of alcohol. He must have had quite a bit to drink. He was more talkative than usual. That guy's house was so spacious and beautiful. The furniture, designed by a famous designer, was really stylish, and all the appliances were high-end, really stood out. Is that so? I nodded, handing Alexander a glass of water. Compared to that, this house being second-hand is a bit, he said, sipping the water and looking around the room. Then, looking like he wanted to say something more, we should at least do something about these cheap-looking furniture. Cheap-looking? Indeed, the furniture and appliances were from my single days, only a few years old and still in good condition. They weren't luxury items, but they weren't so cheap as to warrant his comment. Besides, when Alexander moved in, we decided to keep using the existing furniture and appliances. Isn't that what he said? I pointed this out, but now that we're actually living here, I think new furniture would be better. Alexander said this nonchalantly, not thinking he was in the wrong. It's wasteful to replace them when they're still usable, I said gently, but Alexander suddenly looked at me mockingly. You sound so poor. Maybe it's that poverty mindset ingrained in you. Why would you say that? Anyway, I quit my job so we don't have the money. You quit your job on your own. But you said, blaming me again, huh? With that, Alexander staggered into the bedroom. How could he say such terrible things? Anger started to rise in me, but I tried to convince myself it was just the alcohol talking. He's just bold because of the drink. Don't mind it. But even sober, Alexander's attitude was getting worse. Our conversations were increasingly harsh, filled with complaints about me. What had happened to us? Then, without consulting me, Alexander went and bought new furniture. He even got new golf equipment. He looked delighted, admiring his new golf clubs. Alexander is an employee, but his salary isn't very high. He probably took out a loan, but with me not working, I worried about the repayment. Anxiety grew inside me. Then, an unexpected incident occurred. I was on my way to the supermarket for dinner ingredients. Walking along the road, suddenly, a loud horn blared behind me. Immediately after, I felt a huge impact. My consciousness started to fade. When I came to, an unfamiliar ceiling was above me. It seemed I was lying down. My body ached all over, and I couldn't get up. What happened to me? Mrs. Kloss, have you woken up? An older woman nearby spoke to me. Where am I? You're in a hospital. You were brought in after a traffic accident. Accident? I remember leaving home, but nothing after that. I moved my head. The sterile bed, an IV drip, and the woman in a nurse's uniform. It was indeed a hospital. Looking out the window, it was already dark. I had left home around 2 p.m. So much time had passed. A doctor came and gave me a brief explanation. Apparently, I was hit by a car while on my way to the supermarket, distracted driving. I had several fractures and needed to be hospitalized for a while. I never imagined I'd be in a traffic accident. After receiving the explanation about the hospitalization, a nurse spoke up. The hospital contacted your husband, but the nurse's hesitant tone gave me a bad feeling. I immediately called Alexander. Hello, Alexander? He sounded irritable on the phone. Malia, the hospital called a while ago. You had an accident? That's careless of you. Come back home and make dinner soon. I'm going to be hospitalized. I couldn't believe what he was saying. Angered by my response, Alexander yelled back, Then who's going to do the housework? What? Housework is more important than your wife? Unbelievable. Worrying about housework over his wife's health? Anger welled up inside me and we ended up arguing for a while. Further arguing seemed pointless. I hung up, irritated. Alexander had been harsh lately, but I never knew he could be this cold. I was so upset that night, and with the pain, I couldn't sleep. After a few days, my strength slowly returned, and I started rehabilitation. It was tough at first being bedridden, but it became surprisingly enjoyable. Rehab was a good distraction from lying in bed and overthinking. Since then, I hadn't heard from Alexander. Thinking it would just upset me more, I ignored any contact from him. Around that time, I noticed an elderly man occasionally passing by in the hallway. He was well dressed, not a patient. At first, I thought he was a visitor, but he seemed to be looking at me. One day, the man approached me. Are you Malia Kloss? Yes, that's me, but what is it? I answered cautiously. I didn't know then that this man would change my fate. Eventually, after a month in the hospital, I was discharged. Not fully recovered, but I could manage without patient visits. Finally, I could go home. My house felt strangely nostalgic after a month, but that feeling was short-lived. As soon as I opened the front door, I sensed something was off. There were unfamiliar shoes, heels with flashy pink ribbons. No way. I rushed into the living room and found the house had drastically changed. Not just the furniture, but the appliances were all new, high-end models. Even the curtains were different, as if it were someone else's home. Isn't that Malia? You're discharged? Alexander came out casually, a young woman beside him. With bold-colored hair and a shoulder-exposing dress, she said indifferently, Welcome back. What? Who's this? Stunned, I watched as Alexander smiled. Let me introduce you. This is my girlfriend, Alina. Nice to meet you. Girlfriend? I guess I hadn't mentioned it yet. I'm going to marry Alina. That's why I want a divorce. What? I was at a loss for words. Alexander continued speaking smoothly. I realized what my mother said was right. Without proper parents, one can't do housework properly and ends up looking poor. I thought an older woman like you would be reliable, but being with an older person has become a burden. Alina's young. 23 years old. A new house, a new woman. That's better, right? Alina tilted her head, agreeing with him. And about your accident? It's not a big deal, right? Just a fracture. I don't want to be with someone who uses that as an excuse to slack off housework. We'll take the house. His outrageous claim left me dumbfounded. Don't get me wrong. I plan to buy a new house eventually, but this one is just a stopgag. At this point, his lack of common sense was so extreme, I didn't even feel like talking anymore. The Alexander I knew was gone. What stood before me was not a human, but a monster incapable of reasonable conversation. I shouldn't bother. I took a deep breath. Okay, here, the divorce papers. I handed over the document. You're well prepared, aren't you? I had already signed in advance. Given our recent hostile atmosphere, I had prepared for this possibility. I left them there and began packing my things. I needed to prepare to leave the house. As I was busy packing, Alexander called out to me. You have nowhere to go back to, right? There's an apartment near the station you can rent for $200. It's old and damaged with cracks in the wall. Alexander, that's terrible. The two of them laughed mockingly. I didn't answer and slammed the front door shut. I took a moment to look back at the house I had worked so hard to buy. This would be my last view of it, but I had no regrets. I had a place to go. A week later, in my new home, the doorbell rang loudly. It was Alexander and Alina. Ignoring them, they kept calling my name. Their furious state almost made me laugh. After observing for a while, I spoke through the doorbell. "What do you want?" "Why are you living in this mansion?" Alexander exclaimed. Indeed, the house I was living in now was the one he referred to as a mansion. Over .6 acres of land, a 3-story reinforced concrete building with a pool in the yard. "Did you come here just to ask that?" "No, we have a proposal. Open up, we want to talk." Sounds like a useless conversation. "No, it's important." Persistently, I warned, "This is the last time." Then I opened the door and led them to the living room. I had communicated with Alexander a few times about changing the house's ownership, but I never told him where I was living. When I asked how he found out, it turned out that Alexander had seen me in town by chance and followed me. He was surprised to see me entering this mansion, expecting to see me in a rundown apartment. Alexander and Alina had come up with a brazen plan. Alexander began to speak. "You must be doing some shady business to live in a mansion like this, right?" "Why would you think that?" From the very first word, Alexander started saying things that made no sense, and I was just astounded. "I saw you, with an older man entering this house." Alexander spoke with confidence. "I get it. You don't want to admit it. You're poor, so you have to make money like that, right? But if you have such rich clients, I want you to introduce them to Alina." "I work at a bar, and I'm good at charming older men. I can definitely earn more than Malia." Alina laughed along. I calmly replied, "What are you both talking about? The person I was with is probably my dad. This house is also Dad's." "Liar! You don't have any parents." As Alexander was making a racket, the living room door opened. "What's all this noise?" The elderly man who appeared was the one I called out to. "Dad." "Dad?" Alexander was surprised, and Dad sat beside me and introduced himself. "Alexander, right? My daughter used to help you a lot. Nice to meet you. I'm Malia's dad, Joseph Blyton." "What's going on here?" Alexander looked back and forth between me and Dad, shocked. Not surprisingly, I had only recently reunited with Dad during my hospital stay. The elderly man who spoke to me then was indeed my dad. My dad was supposed to have disappeared. That's what I was told by Mom. So I thought there must be some mistake. But as I talked to this man, I realized he was indeed my real father. Dad had gone to Brazil to start a business. After stabilizing the business, he planned to call us over. However, he was robbed there, losing everything, including his business funds and means of contact. Lost and confused, Dad was taken in by a man who offered him a job at his company. Starting from menial tasks, Dad gradually rose to become the close aide of the company's president. With his help, Dad eventually established his own successful business. But he always worried about Mom and me. Despite the opportunity, guilt over leaving us for so long made it difficult to return. When his company started a new venture in the US, Dad decided to come back. He built a house here and began searching for Mom and me. That's when he learned of Mom's passing. Dad was tormented with regret. If only he had returned sooner. Dad wanted to see me as soon as possible, so he came to the hospital. "That's how I came to live in this mansion, Dad's property," I explained briefly. Also, Dad had investigated Alexander's infidelity. Alexander would go to a bar after playing golf with colleagues, where he met Alina, a bartender. "So this is my family home, understand?" "So, Dad suddenly being rich and showing up? I didn't expect this," Alexander murmured weakly. "But if you have so much money, will you visit the bar where I work?" Alina quickly tried to give her business card to Dad. True to the type of woman Alexander would choose, she is incredibly brazen. Dad immediately stopped her with his hand. "I'm sorry, but I make it a point not to go too cheap, bar-like establishments." Alina was left speechless. Naturally, Dad only frequents ultra-luxury restaurants for business. Alina's cheap bar is a place he would never visit. "Besides, I don't have any money. I've already transferred it all to Malia." Alexander and Alina looked astonished as Dad quickly responded, "About 11 million. It's the least I can do for neglecting her all these years." They were left agape and stunned. Dad told me about Alexander's behavior, especially Alexander. You said terrible things to Malia. She saved from her modest salary to buy that house and worked hard at the household chores. Growing up without a mom, she never had anyone to teach her those things. But Alexander, you belittled her and trampled on her feelings. That's unforgivable. And you even cheated while married. We could take legal action. Dad spoke slowly, and Alexander was visibly shaken. But we won't do that. Part of Malia's struggle is my fault. I decided to say everything I had been thinking for the last time. You always ridiculed me for being poor or not having parents. I'm sick of dealing with someone who lacks a human heart. Don't ever come to this house again. Goodbye. They had nothing to say, just looked frustrated. When they kept sitting there, I coolly told them, "Is there anything else? If you're done, please leave." Overwhelmed by our cold stares, they left the house, disappointed. However, peering through the window, I saw them lingering, looking resentfully at our house. Seeing this, Dad opened the door of the doghouse in the garden. Two ferocious Dobermans burst out. "Help!" Alexander and Alina screamed as they fled. Dad and I laughed together, watching them. It had been a long time since I laughed this much. This should mean I'll never see them again. I could finally live peaceful days. I felt truly relieved. Later, I learned about their pitiful aftermath. Alexander and Alina continued living in that house, but a typhoon hit the area. Heavy rains caused the nearby river to overflow, flooding many homes. Fortunately, my area was not affected, but their house suffered significant damage. They escaped, but Alexander's prized furniture, new golf equipment, and Alina's luxury items were all ruined by the water. Not only that, but the house's pillars, soaked for a long time, had rotted. With nowhere to live, they ended up staying in a shelter for a while. Alexander's family home was too far away to return to, and Alina's family situation was even worse. Alina's parents, addicted to gambling and not working, were living on welfare in a cramped apartment. She had kept this a secret from Alexander, pretending to come from a wealthy family. Alina herself worked at a bar, but was not good at managing her finances and soon found herself broke. Alexander, obsessed with buying luxury furniture and golf equipment, was buried in debt. He had survived his life by having his women partners pay for him, but now found himself in a dire situation. With no other options, the two reluctantly moved into the rundown $200 a month apartment near the station that I had mentioned. Ironically, Alexander and Alina, who had mocked it, ended up living there themselves. What goes around comes around. Without sincere repentance, they are unlikely to find peace. Meanwhile, having resigned from my previous company, I decided to start looking for a new job. When I discussed this with Dad, he offered me a position at his company. It's a sales role similar to my previous job and very fulfilling. While there are many new things to learn, I'm working hard to become an effective member of the team. Dad's mansion sometimes hosts business-related home parties where my sales experience comes in handy, allowing me to comfortably converse with everyone. I'm also not neglecting my Chinese studies, considering the possibility of working abroad. Dad often says, "You look much brighter than when we first reunited." That's what he said. It feels like a lie. Not so long ago, I used to be irritated every day while living with Alexander. Life is unpredictable. No matter how difficult it gets, the hardship doesn't last forever. There's always someone who will appreciate you if you keep looking forward and living positively. I believe in this and want to continue living brightly.